You need some whoop 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 boing. You know?
Moving Wisconsin forward, one joke at a time. This is Kristen Bry with As Goes Wisconsin.
Yada, yada, yada.
Hello, Wisconsin!
Hello, Wisconsin. Welcome to the No Sour Haha Fun Time Power Hour on this beautiful Wednesday afternoon. And we're in the middle of May, but this entire month has been, in case you did not know, Jewish American Heritage Month. And we are very excited for our next guest to talk about the month, what it means, but also bring back our conversation from the first hour as far as religion and people's evolving relationship with their religion. But our guest is Rabbi Moishe Steigmann, who is AKA the Mindful Rabbi. And so he is the rabbi of the congregation Knesset.
Knesset, Israel.
Knesset. Okay. Knesset, Israel. And also founder of Own Your Judaism, which has the tagline, helping Jews do Jewish. So welcome to the show, Rabbi.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I love the intro, all the music.
Yeah,
it's
we
great.
have fun here.
Yeah.
We try to have fun here. And so I'm so excited to talk to you. We touched base last week and I was like, oh, this is going to be an easy, fast conversation. And so I think the first question, and for all the different months we've had since we started the show, we bring people on to talk about culture and ethnicity and stuff. So with Jewish American Heritage Month, who do you think benefits more? The people who are Jewish and the time to celebrate their heritage and their culture and their religion, or people who are not, who there's more resources available and awareness as far as things you maybe didn't know about this group that you were not a part of?
I would think it's more symbiotic than it is either or.
Okay.
Right. You know, as someone who's Jewish, I love the opportunity to celebrate my heritage, not just every single day, not just with Jews, but with the broader community. And I also love learning about other faith practices and other heritages as well. So I think it's a symbiotic relationship that if I have time and space to share about some of my joy, some of my passions about Judaism, and then there are all the other months in the year where I can hear about other faiths and other cultures too, I just think it's a wonderful symbiotic relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it was funny because I was looking up different, we do this with Black History Month as far as like, there is, because history is endless, right? The amount of things that you didn't know and someone finds it and then they make a documentary about it and you're like, oh my God, I had no idea. And so I was looking at some of the lists of activities for this month. I think it was literally on jewishheritagemonth.org.
Okay.
And so yesterday there was a film screening of Jews of the Wild West.
Oh. And it was a full-length movie?
I think it's a full-length documentary. The documentary incorporates interviews, historic photographs, and archival materials from LC's collection. The documentary will be available to Zoom for questions afterwards. Oh, it's a 20-minute screening, so not full length.
There we go.
But it's a story of how Jewish Americans helped shape the West, which I would have I've never heard those stories before, but like, it also makes sense because then the one that's tomorrow is Jewish soldiers in the Civil War.
Absolutely. Look, you know, Jews are a small percentage of the population. Yeah. The census, I think it was in 2020, Jews are about 2.4% of the U.S. population. That being said, Jews have been in this country for a very, very long time. Some of the earliest NBA players, when the National Basketball Association was formed, some of the earliest players were Jewish. Boxers in the 20s and 30s, there was a Jewish contingency of boxers, right? And I say that simply because when you think of 2.4%, you don't think of influencing everything. But when you're part of a culture, when you're part of a country, when you're part of a community, you get to touch on everything that lives within that community.
Absolutely. Superman.
Yeah.
You didn't know that?
Wait, what?
Superman.
Talk more about this.
Superman. I mean, you could probably say more than I do, but you're a comic book fan, right, Greg?
I am.
Superman, like, is Jewish, right? Or like is like like Khalil and a lot of the
there's Jewish connections, Jewish overtones, undertones.
Yes.
Stan Lee, you'll be able to talk more about Stan Lee than I will. Stan Lee's Jewish.
Some of the great comic book creators, yes, I believe that the ones who created Superman were Jewish. I mean, that is in comic book history in the early days, very rich history of Jewish influence in the writings. But yeah, today we say Superman is Jewish. I was like, holy cow! This is
Jewish influence.
yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Right.
But in that creative circle, there's always that influence. I mean, as a stand-up comedian myself, I mean, grew up watching amazing Jewish comedians talking about their experiences, putting onto a microphone their words, making people laugh through like, you know, whether it's like great pain or just, you know, slight annoyances, you know, depending on who's talking.
Right.
But yeah, it's
Right.
amazing.
And so we talked about this briefly last week, but in like a month, like for Jewish American Heritage Month and the things that get planned, like striking the balance of having reverence for the tragedy and ongoing anti-Semitism versus holding space for joy and culture and learning and teaching and all of the like happy aspects. I would imagine, and not that you can speak for this is what we should do, but for you,
Right.
how do you find like the appropriate balance between those two things?
It's a fantastic question, and there's a continual dynamic interplay with that, right? You know, if things are going well, you might focus more on one things. In times of tragedy, you might focus on another. I tend to look back to the history of Jews in the United States, and I do not take it for granted that from the founding of the state all the way back to George Washington, from the founding of the country, Jews were always protected legally.
Mhm.
It doesn't mean there hasn't been anti-Semitism. It doesn't mean there hasn't been hatred. Of course, in the 1950s and other times, there were quotas. We know of the tragic and horrific shooting at the synagogue in Pittsburgh
Yeah.
a couple of years ago. But being Jewish in this country has really been wonderful. I think it was over 50 times in his writings that President Washington paraphrased from the book of Micah. And he uses his, I'll replace that with they. May the children of the stock of Abraham, referring to Jews, who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under their own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make them afraid.
Hmm.
I mean, this is from the foundation of the country. It doesn't mean things are perfect. There are always places to grow, but I really start from a place of gratitude and appreciation that I can be here. I can be comfortable being a Jew publicly, privately. I do not take that for granted at all. And certainly in Jewish history, that has not been commonplace.
Yeah, absolutely. We're talking to Rabbi Moishe Steigmann, who is also known as the Mindful Rabbi. So where did that name come from?
That name came 11 or 12 years ago. My first congregation, my first pulpit after I graduated from rabbinical school was in New York. And one of my congregants, for the first time, began teaching a mindfulness class. She had been doing mindfulness training. I'm that hyperactive person. My brain is always going. I don't sit still. And I was the perfectly worst candidate to do mindfulness, which is why I needed to try this. I wanted to support my congregation, but I wanted to try it. I loved it. It was fantastic. I bought the domain name maybe 12 years ago, had no idea what to do with it. And that is now an evolving process. But that's where it came from.
Okay.
And it's really just kind of stuck. I appreciate that approach. I like being mindful toward everything I do.
So then how does that approach influence, if at all, Own Your Judaism?
Incredibly so.
Okay.
Judaism is a religion of tradition. It's thousands of years old. We have a rich heritage. We have a legal system and legal practices that go back to the Torah, to the Bible, to the 5 books of Moses, thousands of years ago. And part of what it means to follow a faith practice, if you live in this country, we have a constitution, is really to follow the laws and the cultures. And there are also times that I think you need to step back and ask the question, where does this come from? Is the ultimate goal to be automatons and follow every single letter of every single law? Or is the goal to learn what this is trying to teach you, what value, how this helps you be a better person and create a better society? To me, those are the compelling questions. And rather than blindly following things, following laws and practices, I like to know the origins. And oftentimes I like to create my own customs or traditions that reflect the values, reflect the teachings, and feel, to be honest, more meaningful for me and or my community.
So what does that look like in practice then, as far as like the organization, like how do you help Jews do Jewish?
So it's a great question. And I think there are a lot of barriers to entry to many faith practices, right? There are times when I've been in a church, if it's, as a guest for someone, if it's speaking, if it's at a funeral, and I go in, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be doing, right?
You're always my hands.
Yeah, exactly. The hands are always up, like, I don't know what to do. I'm looking
There's
around.
a bowl of water at the door. I don't know what that's about.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Sitting, standing. There's always a barrier to entry to a lot of faith practices, and that's okay. And I want to create things that are easeful, joyful, and social. So if you have a question, if you have an interest, if you have something meaningful or relevant to you, let's talk about it and let's build a custom around that. Sometimes it means bringing in traditional practices into a different space. Sometimes it means doing things differently. I'll give a personal example. The first one that comes to mind. Traditionally on Friday nights, parents bless their kids with the priestly blessings. It comes from the book of Numbers, and it's the only blessing that people gave to people in the Torah that we still give. So there are blessings that God gave to people, but this is a blessing that the priests would give to the people, and we still offer it today. Traditionally, we recite the words from the book of Numbers. What I've started doing is actually taking a teaching from the Torah reading from the week, trying to create a value or a life lesson for my kids and making that the blessing, right? So I'm borrowing this traditional idea, this traditional culture, and nothing against the words of the Torah, but they have their own unique meaning and value. But if I can make this more personal for my kids, and we do this, I do the same thing through my organization. If we have services, if we have religious services, Friday night, I'm going to be at my cousin's house. We have a cousins gathering, some cousins in town. They wanted to do a Friday night service, but they don't want to do the typical Friday night service, right? From their perspective, it's long, it's boring, it's not engaging. So I take a couple of prayers that are easy to sing along with, take a couple of values from the service, have a couple of conversations around it, and we just create a prayer experience that picks up on the themes of the Friday night service. It's more engaging for the people there, especially people who don't know Hebrew. And then you can kind of come in a way that's easeful and joyful, and it works. It's meaningful.
Absolutely. All right. Well, when we come back, I want to bring back the conversation we were having at the beginning, because I think it would be really interesting to get your point of view on the evolving relationship that people have with their religion. Our guest is Rabbi Moishe Steigmann, who is the mindful rabbi and also the founder of Own Your Judaism. Stay with us. This is As Goes Wisconsin. Welcome back to As Goes Wisconsin. I am Kristen Bry. She is Jane Matnair. Greg Bach is here. And also our guest for this half hour is Rabbi Moishe Steigmann, who is the mindful rabbi and founder of Own Your Judaism. And we're talking about Jewish American Heritage Month. And you brought some interesting, fun facts or people of note of Wisconsin that are both overlap of Wisconsin and Jewish heritage. And so, why don't you list off some of those people that people may or may not know about?
Sure. Harry Houdini spent a lot
I always forget that he's from Wisconsin.
Yeah, Appleton.
Yeah.
Golda Meir, former prime minister of Israel, grew up here. There's a Golda Meir school on Prospect in Milwaukee. And lesser known, Packers, for you, Greg, Packers running back A.J. Dillon is Jewish. I didn't know that, actually.
Jane didn't know that either.
Yeah. He was my favorite player in the NFL even before I knew he was Jewish. I hosted him. I hosted him for a conversation. It's on my YouTube channel. You can just YouTube A.J. Dillon Jewish. It'll come right up. I hosted him for a 20-minute conversation talking all about his Jewish history and being a Jew in the NFL. It's a great conversation.
So is he practicing?
How do you define practicing?
Well, I guess is it a part of his identity?
It's part of his identity. Yeah, he's the one who brought it up in some social media posts and has had some conversations around that too.
Is he just the nicest?
I had a conversation with him. I was able to meet him in person very briefly at the Donald Driver charity softball event. He seems like such a nice, genuine person. Really, really does.
See, I'm really selling A.J. Dillon to Greg today to get him more invested in the Packers.
I'm fine.
I
think we did have an intervention here.
Rabbi's a very, very big Packers fan.
I said now that what's his face has gone to a different city, we can maybe chat about it. I was not a fan of him. We'll talk. Maybe
All
you
right.
can do it. Maybe you can do it.
Rabbi, I have a question
no.
for you. When we started off the hour, we were talking about people who have changed their religions that they grew up with, or are not practicing, or are looking for something. And I was raised Catholic, and tell me if this is accurate or not. So when I was raised Catholic, you were told you have to believe that Jesus is the Son of God. That's what will save you. It's not about what you do. It's about believing this. And then you can go do terrible things and go to confession, and then you can start all over. As far as I understand Judaism, though, it is about the works that you do while you're on earth, correct?
Yes. So when I think about Judaism, I do think of a religion that prioritizes action over thought and over faith. And it doesn't mean that faith isn't important. It doesn't mean that thoughts aren't important. But ultimately, it's what we do with those thoughts. People have impulses, good impulses, bad impulses. We can't always control them. We can't always control what pops into our mind. But part of what it means to be a human being, to be a Jew, not to be an animal, is that we don't have to give into those impulses. We can be purposeful. We can be mindful and hopefully make healthy choices. So Judaism really prioritizes the choices that you make, the actions, certainly more than a declaration of faith.
And so with that, what are some of the other, kind of like foundational things as far as not even just a religion, but also just the culture, as far as like the threat of the people, that would you say?
A couple of things jump to mind. And as wonderful as it is talking about Jews who have had a positive influence in this state and in this country, look, we can find people of all religions and all faiths who are, less of those moral barometers. But to me, some of the great contributions of Jews to our country, one is a tremendous capacity for empathy. Jews throughout their history have been persecuted, kicked out of countries, and it's developed, and it goes all the way back to the Torah, all the way back to the 5 books of Moses, that being a Jew, knowing what it means to be enslaved in Egypt, we have a legal, moral, ethical obligation to treat other people kindly, especially people in need. And I think that's a huge sense of ethics and social justice that Jews bring, especially to this country. I hate resting on laurels, but it's certainly the case in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s that Jews were key allies with the civil rights movement. Rabbi Dr. Abraham Joshua Heschel marched alongside Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King very famously. And we shouldn't say we did it then and therefore we've done our job. That should actually be an inspiration for us to continue to be the best allies we can be moving forward. So one is this sense of empathy and ethics and social justice. The other is that Jews we call ourselves a people of the book, right? We have the Torah, we have books, we have laws, and the U.S.'s founding document is really a constitution, a set of laws, a set of principles, and that dynamic interplay. What's the relationship between laws, contemporary mores? How do you do that? That is just a very common conversation in Judaism. It's a common conversation here. Much of the legal system of this country is actually founded on Jewish principles. So there's a lot of connection and influence that I think Jews have had in the ethical and social justice realm, and also in the legal and constitutional world.
Absolutely. Greg, do you want to ask your question with the last 2 minutes we have?
So like we were talking about in the first hour is in the past, I was saying that in the past few years, whenever I think to myself about spirituality, questioning my irreligiosity, one place I always go to is my connection to my friends who are Jewish. Those times I've gone to temple, that sense of family and community that I don't want to say it made me believe, because I think that's a little too easy to do, but I wanted to be there more because I felt a sense of welcoming, even though I didn't share the same faith. But I also hesitated because I never wanted to feel disrespectful in your house of worship. And I guess it's like just, can I come back to temple?
Yes. Yeah. The tagline is helping Jews do Jewish, but it's really anyone who wants to have a connection with Judaism, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a lot that Judaism has to offer. I'm not making a comparison, better or worse, right? I think there's a lot that Judaism has to offer. And if you or anyone wants to experience that, let's figure out a way to do it.
Let's figure out a way to do it.
Yeah.
Greg and I and Jane, you in? We're in.
We're going
Excellent.
to temple.
We're going to temple.
I have
Great.
I have so many questions.
Excellent. I love questions. Jews are a questioning people. We ask a lot of questions.
Rabbi, this was excellent. We will
Yes.
have to have you back, even if it's just to talk about the Packers.
I
But
would love it.
we only scratched the surface, I think.
Wonderful.
All right.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. All right, we got to take a break. We'll be right back.
Russians are coming. Let's get out of here.
With the fever,
Welcome back to As Goes Wisconsin in our last half hour of this packed show with so many great guests. It's just been such a fun, informative show, and we're not going to disappoint for the last half hour because it is also Mental Health Awareness Month. And I recently became aware of the incredible story of the Galvin family, which is a family that had 12 kids, 6 of whom were diagnosed with schizophrenia.
Oh my gosh.
And they were
Doesn't even seem statistically possible.
and so they were the one of the first families to be studied by the National Institute of Mental Health, and is actually the central family in the New York Times best-selling book and Oprah Book Club selection, Hidden Valley Road. And here to talk about the story and the story of survival and then advocacy and being a mental health advocate is Lindsay Galvin Rauch, who is the youngest of the 12 Galvin siblings. Welcome to the show, Lindsay.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
We're so happy to have you here. And so the funny story is that it was your husband who is a fan of the show. And he goes, well, if you're going to talk about mental health, you may want to talk to my wife. And then I dug into the story, and the story is incredible. I mean, it's incredible to learn about. It's probably another thing to live through. And so I guess for people who are unfamiliar, despite the book being such a wild success, I think that it was published in 2020, right?
Yep.
And so your personal experience of growing up in a family where there was the presence of not only, one family member, but 6 family members who had severe mental illness. And so I'm sure you've told this story a lot, but as far as how do you describe what that was like?
Well, my first brother was diagnosed in 1965, the year I was born. And over the course of the next 17 years, 5 of my additional brothers were diagnosed. And so I basically grew up watching one after another of my brothers be kidnapped by this brain disorder. And it was frightening and tragic and sad. And for a child, very difficult to understand for a young child. Even as you get older, it's pretty hard to understand. And so I was really a sibling, and in being a sibling, you're also a victim of the illness, just as the person that's affected by it. And so, all the trauma that occurs for the siblings is pretty much ignored or not addressed. You're usually dealing with the child with the disability, or the brain disorder is the person that gets sort of the whole family ends up dealing with that individual. Now you've got 6 of them. So the other 6 children in our family are the well kids, and quote unquote well. And they have to go about their lives, 1, being terrified of becoming schizophrenic, and 2, sort of having to put their own emotions under wraps, so as to not be a problem for their parents.
Yeah. And so I guess, being the youngest of 12, first of all, that's a story in of itself, is just being one of 12 kids. But I guess, because I often think for any of us, your family is your family, and how you grew up is how you grew up. And it's only when you get older and you start comparing your life to other people's lives, you're like, oh, this was a weird thing in our house. And so for you as the youngest, especially to have your first brother, your brother who got diagnosed first, have that diagnosis happen the same year you were born. When did it become apparent for you that this wasn't just other families weren't like your families, or was that always something that you just knew that this was very abnormal?
Yeah, I think it's intuitive for a child to recognize the behaviors of their siblings when they're psychotic is not normal, because they're so scary. And I think also being the youngest, my older brothers were well aware that this was not normal. So you're listening to your other siblings who are not thrilled about the behaviors and frustrations of having a sibling with schizophrenia. And so I think as a younger child, you tend to mimic that and know right away that there's something not right.
Yeah. And so as your family, volunteered basically to start working with the National Institute of Mental Health, and what was kind of either the theories or the conclusions, or what was found as far as why it was so prevalent with, 6 out of 12 kids?
Well, ultimately, our family, specifically the gene that has the variant on it, is called the Shank gene, which is the gene that's involved in autism. So that's really as far as they were able to. There are many hundreds of genes involved with schizophrenia, but our family specifically, it was the Shank gene that caused the issue. So, as Dr. Friedman, one of the researchers, liked to say, was a perfect cocktail between my parents, or I guess not so perfect a cocktail.
Not so perfect. And so we're talking to Lindsay Rauch, who is the youngest of the Galvin family, who was it was an incredible story of 12 kids, 6 of whom were diagnosed with schizophrenia, and one of the first families that was studied by the National Institute of Mental Health to try to start understanding this terrible disease. And their story is featured in Hidden Valley Road, which was a New York Times bestseller. And so with the the studying and everything, did that help as a
Oh,
kid? Like, was it
yeah.
something that it's like
Mhm.
things that started to make sense by having scientists and doctors involved versus before that involvement? I don't know if it was just the right word is chaos to say, but did it help to start to make sense of things?
Oh, absolutely. I think it provided us all with tremendous hope, because we were convinced in our lifetime that we would see the problem solved. My mother had been labeled as a schizophrenogenic mother, which meant that she was to blame for the illness, which was a common
Oh
in
my gosh.
psychotherapy during those years, during the 60s. And so my parents really turned their back on psychology and went wholeheartedly into the science of it, much to, the dismay of the siblings who probably needed the therapy. Um, and to have completely rebuffed therapy is one thing, but to rebuff it for the kids who really needed it was
Yeah.
really, really difficult. But certainly having researchers involved always provides hope. Just, that is, you're convinced as a kid that they're going to fix it all. So,
And did it? I'm assuming that there's not ever a full fix with any of it, right? And so was it more of there was things that got better, but there were certain things that were inevitably just always going to be part of the family?
absolutely. I mean, my brothers have really severe schizophrenia, and also there's a coexisting condition called anosognosia, which is the inability to have insight. So they are unaware that they have a brain disorder. It's just like Alzheimer's. People with Alzheimer's don't know they have Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
And a vast majority of people with schizophrenia also have this coexisting condition, which is why they live on our city streets. Everyone says, well, why don't they get help? Well, they don't think they have an illness. So it's hard to get yourself help and it's not denial. It's very different. It's actually structural in the brain that prevents them from having that insight. It's called anosognosia. And it's the Henry Amador Center on Anosognosia trains families and first responders and practitioners how to better communicate with somebody that has schizophrenia and anosognosia, because they tend to be very treatment resistant.
Lindsay, I can't even imagine what it was like. And you just talked about how your mother was considered to blame when your brothers turned out to be schizophrenic. But I mean, other than shock therapy, was there even any treatment available? Was everybody just institutionalized still back then?
Well, at that time in history, President Kennedy had created the community mental health centers across the nation, and the funding went from the state hospitals to the community mental health centers. And then it never got, once the law was passed and these community health centers were built in all of our cities, which we all have, the larger institutions were completely defunded. So that's why we see such enormous homeless population in our country.
Mhm.
We're basically housing our mentally ill on our city streets because there are no beds for them any longer. The community mental health center does not provide that service. So, they're in the hospital for 72 hours, 3 weeks at max in our country now, and then they're just turned right back out with nowhere to go. So it's pretty broken. It's extremely.
And so I guess as the it's been decades now as far as firsthand experience for you. And what has been the evolution of what was understood about schizophrenia when you were a kid? So it's like medically, where have we come, and to where the understanding is today, and like how much people actually can treat it or understand where it comes from. And then I guess the second part of that question is, how does that differ from where the general public is as far as what they understand or assume or don't know? And like, what does that evolution look like?
Well, there have been tremendous improvements. In the early days, the antipsychotics were extremely harmful. The Haldols and really intense sedatives, which really didn't fix the illness. They just sedated the person. And shock therapy is still broadly used, but predominantly for severe depression, not for schizophrenia. And so the schizophrenia, people who are affected by it were basically drugged to the point where they could hardly function. They slept so much. And so now they're really the two different camps, psychology and psychiatry, have kind of joined forces. And they realize that you have to support the whole person, both medically and psychologically and occupationally. And we really need wraparound services that enable the individual to be really held up, because it's a pretty disabling illness. And I'm not a scientist, so the theories have been all over the map over the course of my lifetime. I just came back from keynote at the Schizophrenia International Research Society conference in Toronto last week. And the latest and greatest is that it's a metabolic disorder. In my childhood, they were convinced it was genetic, and NIMH spent, tremendous amount of resources pursuing the genetic component of it. Now they're realizing that there's so many different genes involved. It's not going to be like we identify a gene and then we can fix it like many illnesses. It's more like a spectrum disorder. So there's no individual schizophrenia person that suffers that's identical to the next one. They all are completely different. It's like autism in that it's on a spectrum. And so you can have people with schizophrenia that are remarkably high functioning. I think of Ellen Sachs, who wrote The Center Cannot Hold. And, she's a lawyer and a professor at UCLA, and she writes law for mental health. And that's extremely high functioning. And then you look at my brothers who have been pretty badly affected by medication, being over-medicated over the course of their lives, and also being resistant to treatment. That resistance to treatment prevents somebody from really getting early help. Now, today, if a kid is aware that there's such a thing, so one, if the general public is educated so that a child or teen, because it normally strikes between the ages of 15 to 25, if that child knows about it and is able to bring that to the attention of their family without shame, the immediate help for psychosis can actually prevent it from ever happening again. So it's not a lifelong sentence now, which is really a tremendous change that I've seen over the course of my life. There's also a lot of preventative care. Choline, which I think is in the book, which, by the way, is written by Robert Kolker.
Oh, yes.
Is the author of the book. He wrote Lost Girls, which, if anyone's familiar with that, it's fantastic book as well, about a true crime.
We have to go to one. We have one more break, so I'm going to take this break. But Lindsay's going to be here when we come back, because I would love for you to tell us what you wish more of the general public knew about the disease, because I feel like that is there's a lot of misconceptions about that. And so we will be right back with our last commercial break. Stay tuned. This is As Goes Wisconsin. Welcome back to As Goes Wisconsin. I am Kristen Bry with Jane Madnair and Greg Bach. Bach?
Hi.
Hi.
Greg Bach. Fine to meet you. I've known you for what now?
Cool. Yes. And our guest this half hour is Lindsay Rauch, who is the youngest of the 12 Galvin siblings, which is a family that was the first family studied by the National Institute of Mental Health, because of 12 kids, 6 were diagnosed with schizophrenia. And now, Lindsay, as you are a mental health advocate, you are a mother, you're also the sibling who's taken on responsibility of taking care of your siblings who are still living with schizophrenia, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not their primary caregiver. They fortunately are all in nursing homes. They're in the pretty advanced stages. It is a degenerative disease. So over the course of time, it can get worse. And my brothers are really need full-time care, full-time round the clock care now. And, but I manage that care and I'm in constant contact with the caregivers and I go to visit them as often as I can and take them out to do things that are enjoyable to them and make them certainly feel that they have somebody in their life that's a touchstone.
And so, as with your role as a mental health advocate, as you said, you speak on this topic a lot. You were just at a conference speaking on this. Um, where, with the medical advancements and the different, as we said in the last segment, is it metabolic? Is it genetic? There's still things happening as trying to figure it out. But then, as the general public, would you what grade would you give us as far as understanding? Because I feel like there's more and more understanding about depression and people kind of being open-minded and understanding that mental health is health. But like, have you seen the same acceptance from the general public when it comes to something as severe as schizophrenia?
No, absolutely
Yeah.
not. I think it's grossly misunderstood. And I think that unfortunately Hollywood contributes to that enormously, as does the mass media in general. A lot of the mass shooters in our country are diagnosed as mentally ill when in fact they really are more on the sociopath side, which is
Mm,
a behavioral disorder, not a brain disorder, which are two very different things. A behavioral disorder is caused by some kind of serious trauma that occurred in their lives, whereas schizophrenia is either metabolic, combination of metabolic, genetic, perhaps a brain injury occurred. A lot of people with schizophrenia had serious brain injuries in their youth, which is, the acknowledgement that concussions play a big part is important. But I would say the general public in large part, it would be wonderful if they could find greater compassion for these folks that suffer. Not everyone on the streets is a drug addict. Many of them suffer from schizophrenia. And a lot of schizophrenics use street drugs to self-medicate because they don't know how to get the care they need. They don't even know how to get a driver's license, much less keep a day timer with their doctor appointments in it. So we really need a higher level of care for these folks and a greater level of compassion from the general public for not only those affected, but their families. And we need to lose the shame. I mean,
yeah.
it reminds me of like Down syndrome when I was a kid. It was always sort of hush hush. Did you hear that Mr. Smith's, has a Down syndrome son? And now it's commonplace. We don't even think twice about
Yeah.
folks with Down syndrome. I would like to see our culture and society evolve to where there's a greater acceptance of those who suffer from schizophrenia.
Yeah, Lindsay, it's almost like the public assumes that people are choosing this. And
Yeah.
I choose to be schizophrenic and I choose not to get better. Like this is an option, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's why I really dislike the term behavioral health, because in so doing it implies that they have control over this somehow. That you need to behave, you need to control your behaviors. When in reality, they're hearing and seeing audio and visual hallucinations pretty chronically. They're often in a regular psychotic state, which you see them on the streets in our culture. It's really horrible. It's our hospital wards, our city streets.
Yeah. And so that, I mean, I want to end here just because the book was such a success. So the book is Hidden Valley Road, written by Robert Kolker, and it was is reported because it's the real story of your family. It's not a fictional story. And so, do you feel like with the success of that book came some more recognition and understanding and awareness of not only just what your family went through, but what this disease is?
I think so. I think Robert Kolker did a brilliant job of making the story of my family more palatable to the general public and providing them with a greater understanding of the brain disorder. A lot of, there's tons of scientific information out there, but this is sort of the People magazine version of schizophrenia for the general public to help provide them with more information.
Absolutely. So I guess beyond the book, is there other resources or recommendations you would have for our audience if they were interested in learning more about schizophrenia and resources that are available, or people, or what they should just be a little bit more aware of?
I think if you have somebody in your family that suffers, educating yourself through NAMI, the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, I think is really, really critical. Also, if you have a family member, or if you're a first responder or a practitioner, I think it's really important and the general public to understand what anosognosia is and why
Yeah.
people who suffer from schizophrenia don't get the help they need. There is an organization called the Henry Amador Center on Anosognosia that teaches the general public, first responders, practitioners, family members, how to communicate better with somebody that is affected.
All right. Well, thank you so much for spending time with us today. This is such a fascinating story, and just your continued work on it. I'm so happy your husband told me about it. But Lindsay Rauch, thank you so much for spending time with us today.
You bet. Go Badgers.
Go Badgers.
Thank you.
All right. Well, that'll about do it for us today. Good show.
Yeah, good show.
Jam-packed, man.
I know why I called you
Jim.
Greg Bauk, because her last name's Rauch, and I have a friend that I went to high school with who was Bauk.
Doesn't hurt any less.
And so it was a baby brain. This is my go-to for the next 5 years is baby brain.
I get it. I understand. And I forgive you, Caitlin.
All right. Well, tomorrow's gonna be another fun day. We got do you know our new segment?
What?
Public service announcement
Jesus God Almighty.
Oh, it's wonderful.
with Dr. Kristen Lyerly. We do women's health. You don't want to miss it, Greg.
I don't. I'm going to call in with a lot of questions.
Not a bad joke. All right. Well, thank you for texting. Thank you for calling. Thank you for listening and being part of the show. Come back tomorrow. This has been As Goes Wisconsin.